Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT.
Welcome to CIHT Podcasts.
Welcome to Transport Talks, CIHT's podcast. Today we explore 5 key issues and trends for active travel. I'm your host, Justin Ward, and today I'm joined by Professor Rachel Aldred, Director of the Active Travel Academy and from the University of Westminster. So you have said previously that change is possible and can be fast, but we're still a long way from normalising active travel. Could you explain?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think one of the things that I noticed, first of all, when I started studying this area some years back was when you were looking at cycling, certainly, and there's not as much data for walking, but probably shows a similar pattern. When you're looking at cycling was widespread in this country, immediately after World War II. We were looking at, a quarter of all trips being made by bike around 1950. So it was widespread, it was normalised, but it literally fell off a cliff in about 15 years. And by the 1970s, cycling is completely marginal, is 1 to 2% of trips. So, when policy changed, when there were conditions in place to enable a large fall in the level of cycling, that happened very quickly. So that to me suggests that can be reversed. We can see change very fast, although, we are still sort of bumping along at a couple of percent.
And it's interesting the government's position on this across both Westminster and the devolved administrations, isn't it? That gear change from July 2020 set out that they'd like to see half of all journeys in towns and cities cycled or walked by 2030. And similarly, there's similar ambitions across Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales. So it does show that there's a kind of desire in policy terms to get back to that. So we'll see if that happens. What's your kind of feeling on that? Do you think that's an over-ambitious target, or do you think actually setting that target helps drive change?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of in two minds, because I do think, the change we need is ambitious. We do need substantial increases in walking and cycling. But on the other hand, targets do need to be measurable. They need to be measured at interim points. And we also need a target for reducing driving and, to be honest, also looking at car ownership, because the biggest determinant of driving is car ownership. So being kind of honest about what that entails. We're going to have a substantial reduction in the amount of driving. Where are those trips coming from? What do we need to enable that? What kind of alternatives do people need instead? Which is going to differ by area type. So, for instance, when we were looking at potential of e-bikes in the propensity to cycle tool, e-bikes are, potentially make quite a big difference in many places. They enable people to cycle longer distances, to keep cycling for longer, a wider range of people to cycle and so on. But, in hilly rural areas, they can be really transformational.
And the point about reducing vehicle miles by car travel is they've set a target in Scotland of 20% by 2030, but we've not seen something similar. We might see something similar perhaps with a new prime minister, perhaps, but maybe even we did the sort of the current sort of caretaking prime minister. I don't know how we would term that at the moment with Boris Johnson in power. He was former London mayor, so was probably quite pro cycling. So I guess the jury's out on where the ambition lies for addressing car travel in Westminster. I don't know if you've got thoughts on that. But.
I mean, it was great to see that Scotland were talking about this and setting targets, definitely. And also in London, of course, we have targets in the mayoral plan for reducing the amount of car use and also for reducing car ownership. But that does need, those targets, the London targets at 2041, targets in 2030 are very coming up very quickly. But I do think that there needs to be kind of a real acknowledgement of the extent of what is needed to be done to achieve these, interim measurement, consideration of what needs to be done if, say, we're several years into the time frame and that the progress is not as fast as we need. And I think, an honest conversation with people about there's many benefits that can be achieved from making the shift. We need to, we can't afford not to, but at the same time, there are, it is going to be a substantial change for many people. And, how can that change needs to happen? How can we make it as easy and equitable as possible?
And you mentioned London, actually. I live in London, and it's a diverse global city, and I've cycled in London. And it's interesting when I look around at other people who cycle, it's maybe doesn't have that same feeling of been a diverse global city in that cohort, and that I see that as a bit of a challenge. And I think you've kind of alluded to that, why we need to prioritize equity and active travel beyond the gender gap. So could we kind of unpick what you've meant by that? Because I think that's a really, really interesting point to put down in terms of the second issue and challenge that we're kind of wanting to focus on, about that equity issue.
Exactly. So active travel needs to be for everyone. And in many ways, groups that are currently underrepresented in cycling in particular are groups that would potentially benefit most from it. And you can kind of, when you look at gender, you can kind of see that in terms of the types of trips that women make, women's access to cars compared to men. And indeed, when we look at countries that have achieved mass cycling, cities that have achieved mass cycling, so there are examples in the Netherlands, obviously, but also Copenhagen, Japan, Germany, and so on. You will see that in the best cases, women's trip share by cycling, is greater than men. So actually, realising women's cycling potential and the benefits from that in a whole range of ways for women are really substantial. But yes, as I say, we need to look not just at the gender gap, but at all the other gaps that exist, and the ways in which people, older people, disabled people, ethnic minority people, women, children, and so on, are being excluded from active travel. Active travel is being, is particularly hostile for them. And using the example of cycling, for instance, cycling, we're never going to get mass cycling in London without women cycling. Obviously, around 50% of the population is women, but also, 50% of the population is non-white, and we're not, similar. So there are similar issues there. And the ethnicity gap for cycling in London is similar size to the gender gap, but it's not talked about so much. And I was very lucky to work with Akwesi Ose, who's done some research looking at this, and there's a journal article currently under review based on it. And Akwesi did interviews and a focus group with Black men who cycle in London, and really important in shedding light on the kind of range of interconnected barriers that Black men experience for cycling. So, for instance, harassment in public space, whether that is being stopped by the police or whether that is, rape and abuse by drivers, pedestrians, other cyclists, and so on. These kind of multi-layered barriers, and the need for, cycling for public space to be safe and welcoming for everyone, but also kind of issues around what we might call potentially indirect discrimination. So if you think about people having somewhere safe to store bicycles, and this is a particular problem for people who live in flats in London, and London has a much higher proportion of people living in flats than the rest of the country. So why is that a particular issue for Black people or for Black men? Well, actually, when you look at the rates of where people live, if they live in houses or flats, London's Black community is much more likely to live in flats than the Asian or white communities. So, that is potentially a bigger issue for Black people cycling as well, is having somewhere to store their bikes. So there's a range of these issues, and, we just felt that they weren't being talked about enough, whereas at least the gender gap is kind of getting talked about a bit more. But if we just talk about equity in relation to that, then obviously, are we just thinking about white women? Basically, we need to be thinking about all our communities.
I think there's a campaign by Adidas to address that with the sort of perception of Black runners as well, in particularly in cities. And I think it's good when you see kind of that being addressed in various ways, and corporations have a role in that as well. So it's good to see Adidas doing something about that. But I want to be positive, because there are positive stories as well about where we've seen ambitious schemes that have really led to fast and measurable change, and maybe moving a bit from cycling to walking, and where that's happened, I guess, because that's part of that target, isn't it? In gear change, it's not just cycling, but it's cycling and walking in towns and cities, and needing to increase that as well. So kind of thoughts on, or stories on, particularly where positive cases have actually positive changes occurred.
Yes, I mean, for me, I've been very lucky to be able to study with colleagues impacts of schemes that have gone in outer London. We've been running a longitudinal study, so going back to the same people, asking them about their travel behaviour and attitudes over a 6-year period, which is really incredible to be able to follow people up for that long. And at the same time, there was some very ambitious interventions going in outer London. So initially, this was under the Mini Hollands programme, as it was called. So 3 outer London boroughs had funding. It was £100 million £1 billion split between them, which is, it doesn't buy you many motorway junctions, but in terms of active travel, that is, historically a large amount of money in the UK context. So they were given this money over around a 5-year period to invest in, what we're seen as transformational schemes for walking and cycling. So that was Enfield, Kingston and Waltham Forest. Also, we were still running the survey in 2020 and 2021. So we had, COVID interventions, particularly low traffic neighbourhoods, which were put in over 6 months and covered 4% of Londoners. So we were able also to look at the impact of low traffic neighbourhoods in outer London. And we found that these schemes, particularly low traffic neighbourhoods, but also other types of active travel infrastructure, led to early and really quite substantial changes in the amount of walking and cycling that people were doing. And as you allude to, most of that was an increase in walking, which was really interesting. And for me, this was kind of a surprise. I guess, I in the past I'd focused more on cycling, and I guess I thought there was more, that maybe there was more potential to increase cycling. But the amount of additional walking that people were doing when these schemes went in, we're talking, I mean, in terms of the places where the most interventions have gone in, we're talking around, 100 minutes or so extra active travel a week, which is a lot, and the fact that and most of that increase in most of the survey waves was in walking. So there's an awful lot of scope for people to do additional local trips on foot, if the environment encourages them to do so, and if the environment also helps to discourage driving. So I think that for me was really interesting. We did also see an increase in cycling. We did also see an increase in cycling participation. So it wasn't just the same people cycling more, which, although that's not a bad thing, actually new people taking up cycling, so that in the areas with the most interventions, perhaps people perhaps around 50% more likely to have cycled in the past week. So that sounds like a big increase, which it is in relative terms, but obviously from quite a low baseline. What we also found in these areas, particularly where there was most interventions going in, was that after 2 or 3 years we were also seeing a decline in car ownership using the driver and vehicle licensing agency figures. So this is, this hopefully. You can also think that there's potential knock-on effects as well. So people initially start walking and cycling more, new people potentially cycling in particular. People maybe then a couple of years down the line either sell a car, or maybe it's just they don't get a car in the first place, or they don't buy a second car. They make, their trips potentially focus more on local destinations. This can potentially support local high streets. So, being optimistic, one can hope that those kind of ambitious interventions have longer term unfoldings as well.
And you mentioned there about 100 minutes. Was that 100 minutes per week doing more active? Yeah. So that's kind of getting closer to where the World Health Organization recommends that people need to undertake sort of moderate aerobic activity per week. It's sort of somewhere between 150 to 300 minutes per week. So it's that kind of health case agenda, as well as you mentioned, sort of the spending at local things. So that was the third key issue and trend. That was the positive story. So the second one was about equity, and the first one was obviously about change being possible, but and it can be fast, but we're still a long way away from that. So I'd like to move on to the fourth point, is opposition to active travel, especially cycling investment is strongly skewed by car ownership. And I think you'd referenced the low traffic neighbourhoods, and I think we'd seen that a lot when, particularly in 2020, there was kind of strong feelings, probably in a minority, about some of the schemes coming in. But could you just say a bit more about that point, the fourth point on opposition?
In terms of so this actually comes from some research that my colleague Jamie Furlong has been leading, and one of the things that he's been looking at which comes from some survey research, is the extent to which people express opposition or support for cycling investment. So we have one of the survey questions asked them about sort of institutional support from their local authority or Transport for London for different modes of transport, so bus, train, car, bike, walking and so on. And one thing you notice is that support and investment in driving and support and investment in cycling are both quite controversial. The other modes, there's much more consensus, but there's much more division around investment in driving and investment in cycling. So we've kind of unpicked some of this a bit more. And in terms of the the people's views on investment in cycling. We found a range of different factors associated with this. For instance, age with a factor in that the older you were, the more likely you were to oppose cycling investment. I think there was too much current investment in cycling. However, when Jamie built a sort of regression model, sort of unpick what was the really determinant factors underlying this, it turned out that the main reason why older people in the survey were more opposed to cycling investment was that they tended to have higher car ownership, and actually it was car ownership that was driving some of the other differences that we were finding. So that people, with people who lived in households with one car were more negative towards cycling investment than people in households with no car, and then 2 cars or more, then they were more likely to be negative again. Although interestingly, we also had in the model an area-based measure of car ownership. So people who lived in areas with higher car ownership were actually more supportive of cycling investment. So basically, if you're somebody who's living without a car in an area that's very car dependent, you want more cycling investment, which kind of makes sense. But the individual car ownership was a strong determinant of people's attitudes to cycling investment. So sort of linking back to what I was saying before, if some of these ambitious active travel schemes lead to reductions in car ownership, that can potentially drive support for future schemes. In that, I think it kind of it makes sense. I rember reading Transport for London research looking at differences in how people travel, and people in particular, people in 2-car households in London, are much more likely to jump in the car to go somewhere. They don't sort of make that choice that people in households without a car or with 1 car have to make. Are we going to take the car, or what? We're going to get a bus, tube, cycle, walk, or whatever. So people in households with no or 1 cars were more multimodal, and therefore I think more open to using different types of transport.
And you mentioned that sort of ambition, and we've sort of touched on it in various bits of policy. But one really, really interesting thing at the moment is the establishment of Active Travel England and the sort of cycling and walking investment strategy and implementing that on local basis. So do you see that, say we talked in, had another conversation in a year's time, 2 years' time, I don't know, how many more positive stories you'd be able to draw on as a result of particularly the establishment of Active Travel England and Chris Boardman at its helm? Can you give me some thoughts on that? Because I'd like to sort of return to that positive stories, that third point, before we move on to the final kind of the 5th key issue and trend.
Sure, no, of course, and the establishment of Active Travel England, is hugely positive, and the people involved, it's great to see that get up and running and actually employing a significant number of staff and so on. So it's great to see Active Travel England. I think one of the things that is going to have a strong impact is around the funding, and not just the level of funding, which is still not not what we need to deliver transformational change, but also how the funding is allocated and the extent to which it's available long term. So one of the problems that I've been finding looking at local authority experiences of implementing schemes is around they're trying to create transformational schemes by knitting together lots of short-term funding pots that they apply for separately, say capability fund, active travel fund, levelling up fund, all these different funds, and many of these are like 1 year of funding, which is really just not enough. And I know we're going to sort of talk about controversy and schemes in a bit, but many of these schemes that were introduced during COVID times, local authority officers were under extreme pressure. They were, as were many of us generally, and they were having to develop new ways of working. They were often having to respond to very much higher levels of engagement, partly because of the nature of the schemes, but also because, with online engagement, you get a different group, you potentially get many more people engaged and responding. And, for them to be doing this on the basis of short-term, overlapping funding pots, it's really difficult. And I think, I can understand that people feel sceptical about schemes, or they feel sceptical about local authorities when they don't feel there is that meaningful engagement. And, that meaningful engagement requires engagement to be properly resourced at local authorities. You need to be employing people on long-term contracts. They need to be, you need to have skills in that area. But also you need to be resourcing. For instance, one of the examples that I found of local authorities, so consultations, tend to, attract relatively small demographic group of the population, and it's really important to hear other voices. So one example of a local authority that basically improved their engagement by setting up a representative panel, and they got many more younger people, they got many more people that don't own cars, they got a better demographic mix and so on than you typically get in consultations. But part of that, they did have to resource that, they did have to pay to get that sample, and they also had to pay people to participate, because they didn't just want to get people who had very strong views for or against schemes. They wanted to get a representative sample of the population. So these kind of things really do require investment, and some of the measures that can be made and that were made during COVID, thinking about sort of temporary traffic reduction schemes or temporary cycle lanes, they may be relatively cheap to implement initially, but they also they have a relatively large amount of resource needed for engagement. So that needs to be not forgotten, and I really do think we need to move towards a different, both more funding and a longer term funding model that isn't just, it's not just a blank check. Authorities need to refer to, they need to use the standards, they need to construct schemes that do show ambition. But at the moment, I do think it is very hard for them. And in fact, London at the moment is facing a very difficult situation too. One of the ways that London has in the past, and some of the mayoral authorities in the past have been able to do things that are a bit more transformational, has been that they've had access to longer term funding and they've had more resource to enable them to do that.
Okay, yeah, no, so not 100% optimistic then perhaps until we see the money being put behind it. Yeah, it's interesting. You kind of alluded briefly to a couple of things. One was consultation, and I know there's been sort of thoughts about citizens panels that kind of maybe work quite well as a kind of method for supporting that kind of, let's get conversation from a diverse range of views and ideas and put them on the table, and then see where things go. So I guess that's one aspect that might address that. But out of those conversations, you might get controversy, which is, you kind of alluded to that as the final element of the five things. And it's suppose not perhaps a surprise, but controversy about active travel schemes is not only a British thing, and lessons can be learned. So we're not alone in these kind of challenges, but kind of where's the sort of evidence on that, or the kind of cases on that where you're seeing similar kind of challenges being addressed in other countries? So it'd be good to hear a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very easy to think it's uniquely difficult here, but it really isn't. It's also difficult in many other places to implement any kind of schemes that really should make it more difficult to drive. Basically, this is always challenging. Any kind of scheme that restricts access to cars, that restricts car parking, things like that, whatever the merits of the scheme, it's always going to be controversial. It's always going to be challenging. It's always going to be difficult, even if you're in Copenhagen or Amsterdam. It's still. So I think we need to remember that. And even, for instance, the example of Barcelona with Barcelona super blocks, which are often seen, as Barcelona doing, a kind of low traffic neighbourhoody type thing better than us. But there has also been, controversy, debate, opposition around the schemes in Barcelona. And I think, some of the lessons that we can learn from that is the way in which they've attempted to create, use those schemes to give something back to people, or to even to enable people to take something back, because those intersections that were freed up when they substantially reduced motor traffic, and the space that can then be used for other purposes, and enabling citizens and neighbours to sort of set up it might be pop-up sports events, it might be cinemas and so on, so to enable people who live locally to use that space. And then it's not just seen as something, okay, the cars have gone, but what can actually be done with this in a context where many people live in relatively small flats. They don't have often private outdoor space, and there's limited public green space in much of Barcelona as well. So using that to give back and to try and find out what the neighbours want. And obviously, in the UK context of scheme rollout in 2020 and 2021, in the context of COVID restrictions, it was very hard to be able to do some of that. But now in this current period, particularly as we know outdoor activities are relatively safe from airborne viruses, some of those things could be implemented. I think also there have been a lot of lessons potentially from our own experiences as well, and things that were maybe missed and picked up on later should be built in planning. So one of the issues with controversy as well is that it can be hard. It makes planners defensive. They sort of hear a lot of shouting and it's easy for them to think that all opposition is shouting, and this is not the case. And people have, when we need to substantially reduce car use, but equally and car use is indeed very skewed, such that rich people drive more than poor people and so on. But equally, there are people who are, on low incomes, disabled people who are dependent on cars. Not all disabled people, but some are. So it's really important to hear those voices and to think about mitigations and also, for instance, improvements for disabled pedestrians when schemes go in and so on. So, what can be done positively to improve accessibility for particular groups, to make more welcoming environments for particular groups as schemes go in, and not just wait, until a few months down the line, people are saying, well, I still can't cross the road because there's no dropped curb, but actually to do some of that engagement upfront to find out the problems that particular groups may experience, so thinking about those kind of accessibility measures, benches, curb cuts, tactile paving and so on that may need to be implemented to improve the environment, and also thinking about mitigations for specific groups that maybe find it particularly difficult to reduce dependence on cars. So I think those kind of things, some authorities have learned a lot about them and have started to put them in place in a proactive way rather than waiting until people shout at them afterwards. But it is hard, particularly when if you don't have longer term resource to build that in, it has to be done, but it's often a struggle to find funds.
I like that final point about the designing places for all types of people, and therefore the inclusive agenda and designing for disabilities is kind of core. And it's good you mentioned that, because I think that's almost one of the kind of core elements of the 5 key trends, that we always have to kind of keep that in mind. And interestingly, my brother actually lives in Barcelona, so he's mentioned the super blocks. He says, oh, you should look at that. So it's good that you've finally we've focused on that a bit and heard a bit about that, because certainly as a city, yes, it's quite urbanly dense and there's not that green space. So maybe creating spaces where people can kind of have places to interact and meet and hang out and so on, that's a really kind of interesting thing in that city particularly. But yeah, so just going in reverse order, because I think it's kind of, it goes from the sort of five key issues, kind of starting from the more sort of negative. The controversy is one of them, opposition as a second one, but then moving more to positive stories, prioritizing equity as the fourth one, and then finally change is possible. So it's really positive. I think let's try and end on the change is possible point with active travel. So thank you so much for your time. That was an interview with Professor Rachel Aldred from the University of Westminster and the director of the Active Travel Academy. So thanks very much for your time.
Excellent. You should definitely visit Barcelona.
Yeah, my brother will say that as well, so I'll put that in the calendar. Yeah, it'd be cool to go and see the super blocks as well. So yeah, no, that's a good final tip for me, actually. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, thanks again.
Yeah, no worries. And yeah, good to speak.
Joining a professional body has never been more important. Join thousands of other professionals just like you who are getting ahead with CIHT membership. Go to the CIHT website and discover exclusive resources and why the leaders and future leaders of the sector are members with CIHT.